topic of the webinar is very fitting when the entire globe is going through a crisis. And generally speaking, COVID has actually led to a new reality in just 2 months. And you've seen that it has led to sort of recalibration of the bubble of the personal spaces that we humans kept around ourselves. It has essentially assassinated the whole culture of handshakes, whole culture of hugging people. And this has happened all around the world, and India's age-old practice of doing pranam is considered now to be most sensible way of wishing each other. So it has also subdued the fashion culture. Many people in urban areas could now be seen in disabled now, and you will find people in casual dressing outside their houses picking up their morning milk and vegetables. So they're not bothered about what they are wearing. So they'll go there. I also go there, pick the milk, pick the vegetables. So this is all new practice altogether. Basically, it has thrust upon us kind of a physical distancing. And what else? We have done away with the extravagant lifestyle. No dining out, no social gatherings. People are doing self-cooking, following the YouTube videos, and they're posting pictures of house cleaning on Twitter, Instagram, and whatnot. But there are, in fact, if you look at these changes, these are actually just temporary changes. And these are easily reversible changes. But as practitioners of history, we have been trained to look at the long-term changes and the causations in all such events of the past. So in that sense, the long-term implications and causes involved in the spread of diseases and epidemics of the past centuries have often been much bigger. And in fact, one of the most common reasons behind this transmission of diseases that we see, which is also in some way the most consequential impact of the epidemics, it is largely the mobility of the people. So you've seen that even in COVID, it's the people who have moved from different countries, they have brought the disease here. So movement of people has actually played the most significant role in the history of diseases and epidemics even in the past. So friends, in my talk today, I would focus on three major issues. So there are many issues actually related to the diseases in terms of history, but I'll focus on three issues. First, that how diseases actually and the disease exchanges actually take place, and how these disease exchanges have taken place in the past. And we will look at some of the historical case studies. Secondly, we will also see that while the poor and the downtrodden are the worst hit during the pandemics or the epidemics. In that sense, much more than the disease itself, the reason for the immense mortality during the epidemics is always the hunger. So it's not actually the disease which is killing. The disease kills because people are hungry. People have not been fed. So that's one of the most crucial thing. Even in present time, we've seen people, migrating, but then they're hungry people, and that's something we have to be very careful about, because the disease becomes, it leads to mortality when your immune system becomes weak. So it's very essential that food is provided to the people. And thirdly, why there has been a tendency by the states to conceal the real pictures, which unfortunately has a cascading impact, especially on those who are on the margins. So let's begin with the first one, the exchanges of the disease. Now, all of you must have observed that the white Europeans are found all around the world. You go to any country, you'll find that the white Europeans are dominant there, except in India. and of course many of the Southeast Asian nations. And if you look at the world map, you would see that the countries where they became settlers, because all of them migrated from Europe. So the countries where they became settlers, such as United States or Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the likes, they're actually the countries in the temperate zones. So all the colonization that has happened, and in fact the colonization has taken place all around the globe. It's not only the temperate zone where the colonization has actually taken place. So all of these colonizations happen in the entire globe. And what has happened in the process, that many parts of the world were brought under the colonial control. Countries like India, they survived the white European settlement. So whereas you will see that United States or Australia was actually snatched away by white Europeans from the Aboriginals.
Yes.
That is the original inhabitants of those countries. In a way, this ecological hostility actually has led to massive resource exploitation of India. And it has actually done an enormous drain of revenue even from India. So India has suffered because of this enormous drain of revenue and resources, but you will see that the white Europeans have not been able to settle here in India. And one of the prime reasons and the prime mover for this is that in the entire course of history during the 16th and the 17th centuries, there was a mobility of the ships. The ships were doing all the movements, and this led to the transmission of diseases. Now here in India, they could not settle, and the simple reason was it was a tropical nation. So all the tropical nations actually survived the white European settlements. Now, of course, this movement of the ships, it all started after Christopher Columbus' discovery of America in 1492. Christopher Columbus obtained kind of a financial support from Isabella and Ferdinand of Spain. So they, in fact, authorized him to explore and claim for Spain any, previously unknown land, whatever land which is unknown to the world, and islands surrounding the Atlantic Ocean. So, Ferdinand of Spain sent Christopher Columbus for exploration. And he went there blindly. He was not knowing that there is any island existing. So when Columbus is out in the Atlantic on his ship, what he does is that he picks up the prevailing winds, because that's how the ships moved in the 15th century. So he picks up the prevailing winds, and he followed the migratory birds, which was in fact a technique of finding land in vast oceans, because you don't have any other kind of device for you available to you. So during those days, he then reached an island in the Atlantic Ocean, and this island was the Bahamas. And it took many days for him to come to such kind of an island. Now this event of discovering a new land established a new connection, a new conjecture altogether, because it's something which has brought the diseases. It has led to a new history of diseases in the entire world. So although locally speaking, in India we might be having many diseases in existence, but in terms of world, in terms of global level, we find that it is the event of the discovery of America by Christopher Columbus, which has started the history of diseases for the world. So what it has done, that it has established a new maritime connection. The connection is between the old world and the new world. So this old world is basically the world of Europe, the world of all these Asian nations. So there is a connection established now between the eastern hemispheres of Europe, all these areas of Eastern Europe, and then the Western hemisphere, that is the entire America, both North and the South. So this is a new connection that has been established after Christopher Columbus' finding. So what happens after 1492 is very important for us to understand, because the interaction between humans and nature throughout the globe changed irrevocably. And the mobility was so permanent that the phenomena became so kind of irreversible thing. You cannot change it. People have now found the land and they find there are new resources. So that is something which was new for the world, and it has actually transformed the whole course of history. Now each ship and in each ship journey, Columbus, or for that matter, any of the ships which were traveling to different nations, they had, they were carrying kind of domesticated animals. And when they were carrying domesticated animals, mind you, they were also carrying vermins, such as, you have the rats and the insects and the weeds going with the ships. And then with these ships also went the microbes, the new microbes, the virus, the germs. And these were deadly ones. The deadly ones because they were, they're deadly for the aboriginals because they were not exposed to these kind of microbes and the virus. And they traveled with the people who were traveling from Europe. So they also carried animals, cattle, insects. So all these were carriers of some kind of microbes. Perhaps, it is estimated that some 2.5, I think 250,000 or something Spaniards travel in the New World between Christopher Columbus' discovery and in the next 50 years. So, and in another 50 years, you will find that this travel has actually doubled almost. So let me tell you that it's a very interesting story of disease, because when Columbus travels there, what happens is something very interesting for us to know. What happened that after visiting several islands, Columbus lands on a coast of Hispaniola, and here he establishes a small encampment, what was known as, I think it was known as Navidad, and it was here that he finds the indigenous people, the aboriginals here. They were, not resisting because they were not a military threat at all. They lacked all kinds of iron and steel weapons. So they had no weapons with them. So there was no resistance. But, what was interesting that these aboriginals, they wore beaten gold ornaments. And they had this knowledge of mining gold. That was what Columbus could make out. So Columbus and his men began negotiating with these aboriginals. They tried to understand that where this gold has actually come from. So they were possibly thinking that there is a gold mine here in the Bahamas. And then they discovered that there was a gold mine in the Bahamas at that place in Hispaniola. So in next few days, Christopher Columbus and his men start collecting and accumulating a lot of gold. And Columbus decides to return to Spain with the gold. His ship was laden with gold. And he asked all those 39 Spaniards who had come with him, he asked them, 39 Spaniards, to remain behind in Navidad, so that when he comes back, he has a lot of gold again collected, and then he can carry the ship. So he carried, several of the Taino men, the aboriginals, women, children with them, and many of the crops. So the sweet corns that we eat today is actually the corn which was brought by Christopher Columbus from Hispaniola to Europe, and that's how the cultivation of sweet corn started. So within 6 months, Columbus again sets out from Spain. He goes back with the gold, and then he comes back again. This time he comes back with 17 ships and with 1,500 crews. Not only crews, there were people who were asked to be, doing the colonization work there. So with him, he brought many things like wheat, chicken peas, kabli chana, and everything, whatever, new, all old world grains that you find. He brought all the ships, goats, swines, cattle. But then these exchanges take place because, as I said, that these animals are also carriers of many of the microbes. And then they brought the diseases here. These aboriginals were not exposed to these diseases, and people were not understanding what was happening. But surprisingly, what happened that when Columbus reaches Navidad in maybe some 9 months or after a year, he was in for a surprise actually, because what he finds was shocking. He found that his 39 Spaniards that he has left behind, they were all dead. So, and they were dead because of the exposure of syphilis, but he didn't know that they have died because of the syphilis. He understood that there was some kind of disease which has occurred, and this disease has led to the death. But at that time, this kind of a disease was considered to be a sin. If you commit, it was considered to be a result of a sin. So if you've done some sin, you are then infected with diseases and then you die. That was the belief of those years. Whereas, the recent findings have suggested that syphilis is actually a disease which is a sexually transmitted disease. So all these 39 crew members who were left behind, they came in contact with the ladies, the Aboriginal ladies, and then that's how they were infected by syphilis. Now, mind you, syphilis was not in existence in Europe before that. So that's something. It's not only that the European disease have infected them. There are certain diseases of the Aboriginals who were immune to such diseases, but when Europeans come in contact with those diseases, they get killed. So Spaniards who had come in, the second journey actually colonized the huge land. And when they stay there, they led to spread of smallpox disease. So, the Aboriginals, within 50 years, the entire population of Hispaniola actually died because of the smallpox. Because smallpox was not a disease there in Hispaniola. It was brought by all these people from Europe. So all the microbes of this whole world and the diseases of this, what I call the whole world as the Eastern Hemisphere. So, and, these European diseases, they were actually very harsh ones. They were life-threatening diseases. So it's not only the smallpox. There were measles, diphtheria, you have whooping cough, chickenpox. All these diseases actually led to the death of the Aboriginals. And these diseases, many of them were communicable diseases, communicable by air, communicable by touch. And that's how, the death occurred. Now, the transmission of syphilis had an impact even in Europe. And it has another very interesting story. What happened that the crew member, the second tranche of the crew members who had gone with the Christopher Columbus, they were infected with syphilis. So they were carriers of syphilis. And if you must be knowing that there was a massive syphilis outbreak in Europe in 1495. And it occurred among the French troops who were actually brought to Naples because, the French army had invaded Naples and it had laid siege to the fort at Naples. It is in this army that this outbreak of syphilis happened. Alfred Crosby has done a very interesting work on that, and he has actually suggested that this outbreak of syphilis took place because many of the crew members who had gone with Christopher Columbus, they came back to Europe and then joined the French army under Charles VIII. So the Charles VIII had these these crew members as soldiers. And they were the carriers of syphilis diseases, and from there on, the disease spread to the other Europeans, and then to the surrounding regions of Europe. So you can understand these diseases travel and they move to distance, and you travel continents. So with this we come to our next question: that why the poor and the downtrodden are the worst affected people. Epidemics of past have always had grave implications on marginalized. If you if you look at the history of these diseases. The poor, the marginalized, they are the most people who face the mortality. I'm not talking about the spread of the disease itself, because like now we have coronavirus, which is spreading, and it is, affecting many people around the globe. But you will find at the end of it that it's actually the people on the margins who face the mortality. And the reason why I'm saying that we have a history behind it, and it has happened in history, because what happens that when you have certain diseases or epidemics taking place, the state always becomes dominant, and then it tries to make the economy run. And it has happened in history. In all histories of diseases, you will find this. It's not unique to countries like United States or China or India. It had happened in past. So in fact, we can say that the diseases and the epidemics often affect most who are on the brink of survival. The daily wagers, like we have been seeing, they've been migrating the cities. What is sort of kind of a reverse migration, because they had come from places like Bihar, Bengal, Orissa, UP, and they have all preferred to migrate because they are uncertain about the future state of affairs. And when they are reaching back to their villages, they are ostracized, mind you, because even in their village, they are not allowed to enter inside the village. Even their own brethren have asked them to stay away. So, the relief that the governments have been announcing, and the relief being announced by the governments, are incomprehensible to them. You speak to them, they don't understand. And they're not able to understand the grand packages that the governments are announcing. What we are listening to in televisions, or what is being debated in the intellectual circle, is not understandable to them. So the gallimaufry of the reforms that we see, kind of reforms that are coming in every day, announced by finance minister or different ministers, it's not intelligible to the poor. It is not working because it's still a middle class centric, and it's more of a kind of a gainful to the corporates. So all the reforms that we are actually seeing, and it has happened in histories also, these are very middle class centric, and that's why you find people going into the balconies, celebrating, kind of as if the coronavirus would not affect them. I think these are some few things which reminds me of many of the occurrences of the past. But let me come back to the real issue. Why the daily wagers are not ready to join this chorus with the urban middle class. Why they have preferred to migrate? Because they are facing the difficulties. Because they have an atmosphere of uncertainty. They are not certain. The B line on the Delhi UP border was, you remember, 2 months back it was being represented as uncultured and barbaric. Now it is today. Even the governments are doing all efforts to take them to their homes. So trains are being run. So government is doing all efforts. But it could have been done earlier if we had learned from the past. If we had learned from history, we would have done it earlier. But for the huge number of daily wage workers, this is kind of a survival strategy. They are desperate to run to their villages. And this kind of a very interesting study, I remember, was done by James Scott when he wrote an interesting book called The Art of Not Being Governed, wherein he writes a similar situation about a Zomia community of Southeast Asia. And he says that they were understood as runaway fugitive people. But instead, what the reality was, that they were actually migrating because they were not ready to, get oppressed due to the epidemics that had come. So in epidemics, what is happening, that it has stopped the economy. It has stopped the economy. It has stopped the money for these poor. And that's what, these poor, that's why the poor are actually being forced to migrate. So interestingly, state always, thrives. I mean, we have in cases in history when we see that the state thrives in times of pandemic. And it happened after cholera epidemic in the 17th century Naples. And if you look at the history of the smallpox epidemic that happened in 1717 Bengal, it also happened in the Spanish flu. So during all these epidemics, the states became dominant. Citizens become so fearful. They were ready to listen to any of the pronouncement by the state. So if the state says that, so I can say that people were forced to surrender their, even their rights to life and maybe even death. So they are ready to do anything because it's kind of a disease that has come, which is not in the hands of the people. So the states become the only, only people on whom people think that they can rely on to survive these epidemics. I'll be giving you two, very interesting historical case studies. One from the Naples cholera, and the other from 18th century Bengal, which Bengal at that time included Bihar and Orissa. So in both these cases, the disease often took the epidemic proportion because of the poverty and the hunger. In 17th century Italy, plague became very disastrous, and then we had, all those ambitious absolutist monarchs at that time. And, their armies at that time were damn expensive, mind you. So all the armies of medieval and early modern times were expensive. So these monarchs were not ready to reduce the number of soldiers. So half of their budget was actually swallowed up by these armies and military institutions. And wars in that sense during those years actually acted as a predators because they caused deaths, and this led to heavy taxation because you have to maintain your army. So when epidemics came, when the wars were over and when the epidemics appeared, that is, I'm talking about the peace times, the droughts actually struck also. And during those years, what happens is that the poor, the marginals, they face the shortage of food. And then the state is not able to provide them food because it is spending a lot of money on something else, maintaining the army. Whereas it could have then reduced the number of soldiers, but it did not want to lose its power. And that's why, the people on the margin suffer. So I think we don't have much time, but I think there is a very interesting work by Emmanuel Reduri, when he speaks about in his book called The Mind and the Methods of Historian, wherein he describes the whole issue of, how the poor gets marginalized when such epidemics take place. Now let's turn quickly to the 1770 phenomena in India, Bengal. Here you have a massive famine took place, which led to the death of some estimated to be around 10 million people. And David Arnold has done a very interesting work on this 18th century epidemic. But then he argues that a large proportion of death were due to the spread of smallpox and cholera. He argues in his work that the killer diseases, these two diseases, were integral part of the hostile Indian climate at that time, and he has mentioned of all this in the context of his modern medicine knowledge that he's talking about. He says that it is only on the basis of European knowledge of medicine that the diseases got suppressed. But try to understand the real issue, which David Arnold or many of the European historians have trivialized. He is sort of downplaying the whole question of high mortality that has taken place. Why people have died in such a large number? And if he's saying that it's actually disease which has killed, it's not the reality. So I've written that in my book, which was published last year, wherein I have I've given all accounts wherein I suggest that although the disease, smallpox and cholera were the reasons behind the death of such large number of population, but these diseases were not actually the real reasons. The real reasons were something else, because the British government was hell-bent. It had just got in 1765, got the Diwani rights in Bengal, and it was hell-bent on collecting revenue. So there were no relief measures. And it was investing a lot of money in maintaining the soldiers and armies at that time, small, all those contingents which had come from Britain. In fact, I would refer to one of the works of Holwell, who was a surgeon of the East India Company at that time, and he was in fact one of the survivors of the black hole incident that had taken place. He has mentioned a very interesting thing about this, this smallpox, and he writes about the method of prevention of smallpox that were already there in practice in Bengal even before 1770. So he says that there was kind of a pus, discharge of fluid that happens when smallpox takes place. He says that people, he saw in Bengal that the people, they were the pus of the infected people, it was taken out and then it was inoculated as a vaccine on the uninfected people. So some kind of a cut was made in the arms, somewhere midway between the wrist and the elbow, and this was for the male, and for the females it was done above the elbow on the soldiers. So he mentions that in his account of 1767, and he says that suggests that smallpox was already there in India in existence. So it could not have taken an epidemic form which could have led to such huge death. So the real reason, and that's why Sitala Mata, goddess, was also worshipped because of this. That's why even today, when you go to villages, you will find somebody who was infected. When we were small children, it was suggested that Mata Ailbani, like in Bhojpuri we used to say, or maybe in the Maghi, Mata Ailathin. So all these things you will find in villages in those yesteryears. But then why this kind of a worship of Sitala Mata was taking place? Because smallpox was already a disease, very common disease. And if you read many of the 7th and 8th century accounts, you will find mentions of treatment of smallpox. So our Professor Zigar Muhammad mentioned about all those vernacular literatures and accounts, medieval accounts, wherein you have these, the way that these diseases were treated, and we have reference to that. So similarly, cholera was also an epidemic before 1770. So what I'm suggesting is that, this 1770 deaths, the large number of mortality that has taken place, it was not exactly, because of the climatic conditions and that's how the disease spread. It's actually because the people were not fed properly. There was famine. Famine is what? Famine is actually the failure of the state to provide food to the poor. So when the state fails to provide food, then the disease becomes dominant and it leads to mortality. That's something which we have to learn even in the present times. Let me take you quickly, very quickly, to my third conjecture, and that's about what I say is that why is it that the states have these tendency to conceal the epidemics? And whenever new diseases occur in historical past, it has happened in histories also, that the doctors of the time were almost flummoxed by uncommon medical conditions. So they were not, at that time, whenever the disease happens, they are not really knowing that what is the real reason behind the spread of the disease. And it is happening even today. So, what happens is that with the growing mystery of coronavirus that we see today, the world has started realizing that, and much of the initial outbreak stories have been concealed by China. So it has been concealed, and I think Trump has gone to the extent of calling COVID-19 as a Chinese virus, because countries have been trying to hide their real pictures. It sounds erroneous because it is very difficult to trace the origin of a germ in such a globalized world. But I think there could be some truth, because all the states conceal the disease in their own way. China concealed it, and many other countries are concealing the disease. Now, I'll just give you a very interesting case study from Suez Canal, which is to suggest that in historical past also such concealments of disease has taken place. And Suez Canal was constructed in 1869, as you know, and it allowed faster and less time-taking ship movements between Europe and Asian colonies by the British. So, the canal actually linked the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, and it reduced the journey of the European ships by some 5,000 miles. Now, because earlier they had to take all the way to the Cape of Good Hope route and then reach Europe, but now they can pass through the canals. Now, what happens that in the decade of the 80s, there was an outbreak of cholera epidemic in Bengal, in Calcutta. And all the European countries were putting pressure on Britain to quarantine the crew. All the crew members who are coming on the ships in the Suez, from the Suez Canal, and the labor which was coming on the British ships, they were asked to be quarantined. Now, Turkey also raised her concern at that time because Jeddah was an important port in the Red Sea at that time, and it was from here that many Muslim pilgrims used to go to Mecca. So, the quarantine stations on the north and south side of Red Sea were constructed, and they were, these people, all these crew members and the laborers who were coming on the British ships, they were forced to undergo long periods of quarantine on the ship itself. Now, what is happening that it was leading to the huge cost for Britain. And Britain actually, what Britain did, that they wanted to get out of this kind of a perception among the Europeans when they were forcing Britain to quarantine these people for so long. So Britain appointed a government panel, and it was a panel of medical experts, and this was to send a message to the outside world, like the WHO that we have today, that Britain is actually very serious about the disease epidemiology. And what is interestingly happening is that Britain was very careful not to include any such doctors on the panel who was sympathetic to, I think you must have heard of Robert Koch's germ theory. So he was already, at that time Koch was saying that cholera is actually spreading because of the germs. So they thought that, we should not include any such doctor in the expert panel who's agreeing with Koch's idea of, germ theory. Therefore, when the investigations on cholera patients were done in Egypt, the microscopical studies of water supplies were not done. And it was suggested that, this disease which has spread in Egypt, the cholera spread, which has taken place in Egypt also, it's not because of the people of Calcutta who has brought here. They said that it has happened because in 1865 there was an outbreak of cholera already in Turkey, and it has actually revived. So the germs have become active again, and that's why the cholera has taken place in Egypt. So Koch was actually not convinced at all. In fact, he came to Calcutta also. So if you read the history of Robert Koch, you will find that Koch had come to Calcutta. He wanted to study about cholera disease because his hypothesis was something else. So it took many more years to develop a vaccine. It delayed actually. So this kind of a concealment of fact of the disease actually led to the delay of the origin of the vaccine for cholera, and it took many, almost 10, 12 years. So to end my discussion, I would suggest that disease actually take, these epidemic proportions largely because of the mobilities and movements of the people. And we, in modern times, should understand that, we can actually, whenever a disease like this or a novel disease like this happens, we should try to stop the movement there and then only. We should not wait for the disease to come and to spread. And secondly, the histories also suggest that, these microbes always produce same diseases. They are, they have susceptible hosts, and we should always be feeding the poor because they are on the margins, and they should be provided with enough food so that they are strong, their immune system remains strong, and they don't suffer economically. And that's how we can save them from mortality. So it's very important whenever such epidemics take place, we need to provide them a lot of food, and that's how we can learn from history. Thank you so much.